The portion of Yisro talks about the 10 commandments that were given on Sinai. However, as a prerequisite to the 10 commandments, we find that the Torah makes certain conditions and certain instructions. Chapter 19, verse number 1 begins that it was the 3rd month when the Jewish people left the land of Egypt. And Moses goes up to the mountain, and God tells Moses the following in verse number 3. So shall you tell the daughters of Israel, the women, who is called the Beis Yaakov, the house of Jacob, for they are not only a wife, they are the home. They create the entire home. V'saged livnei Yisrael. And then you shall dictate these laws to the sons of Israel. So first the wives and the mothers and the daughters, and then talk to the men. Rashi tells us here on this verse, V'saged livnei Yisrael. And Koyseimar, what does it mean? Like this you shall say. Says Rashi, B'loshen hazeh, in this lashon, these terminologies, U'cheseder hazeh, and in this order. What does it mean, these words and these terminologies? Rashi clarifies in the next verse, V'saged livnei Yisrael, Leveis Yaakov, Elu Anoshim. When you speak to the women, you should talk to them in a soft, gentle way. When you talk to the men, you should tell them the unshim, the punishments, dukin, and the details of the mitzvahs. Parash, l'zcharim, dvarim, akoshim, kigidim, you shall explain and elaborate to the men these words with tremendous strength that are hard like the veins. In other words, when you talk to the women, talk to them in a soft way. What does that mean? Says the Mechilta, this means that you should tell them the general laws. Because once you give a woman the general law, she has the capacity to understand the details on their own. That is the opinion of the Mechilta. And that is the meaning of Lashon Raka, in a soft way. You don't have to tell them the punishments if you don't do this. They understand the beauty of the mitzvahs. They understand the importance of the mitzvahs. They understand the holiness of the mitzvahs. And as long as you tell them the general concept, like make Shabbos, they know what it means to make Shabbos. And they're able to prepare the entire home for Shabbos. The man, you have to tell them all the details. There are 39 prohibitions, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And how exactly you should tie your shoes, and how you put on your tie, and what color shirt you should wear. The men need to know all the details. This is the approach of the Mechilta. And says Rashi that this has to be done b'lashon hazeh, cheseder hazeh, that this is the way it should be done for all times. When you talk to men, you talk to women, first speak to the women, then talk to the men, number 1, which is the concept of ladies first. This is already originated here in the Torah from this verse. And this is the pattern, this is the approach you should take when you teach women, and the approach you should take when you teach men. This is the first Rashi. Then we find another Rashi. A few verses later, at the end of verse number 6, after the Torah says you shall be a nation of kings or Kohanim, and you shall be a holy people, and these are the words that you shall tell the people of Israel. On the words Eila Dvarim, these are the words, says Rashi, something which seems to be contradictory. Eila Dvarim lepoches v'lo yoser. These words you shall tell the Jewish people, not less and not more. A moment ago, God tells Moshe how you should talk to the men, how you should talk to the women. Now it's obvious that Moshe Rabbeinu as a teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu as a leader, and the same is true for every teacher. When you give over a teaching, you can't stick exactly to the words. You have to elaborate. So God gave over the commandments, 10 commandments. You have to elaborate what it means. Similarly, you're talking to men, you're talking to women, you have to give over the details. And you have to expound on it. Sometimes you look at the crowd and you see they don't get it. You have to use a different parable, a different example. So, why does the Torah say here, and these are the words, lo pachos v'lo yoser, not less and not more? A moment ago we said yes, talk to the men this way, talk to the women that way, each one differently. All of a sudden here, in verse number 6, Rashi says the opposite. Do not say less, do not say more. Now, the Gur Aryeh, known as the Maral of Prague, says that we are concerned that maybe Moshe Rabbeinu would convince the Jewish people, over persuasive, and he would, so to speak, in a platonic level, seduce them to keep the Torah. So God says, no, don't speak about it too much, lo yoser, because later generations should not come along and say that you coerced the Jewish people or you persuaded them very strongly to keep the Torah. And therefore, not less and not more. However, this only explains why Rashi says, do not over-speak it, over-say it. It doesn't say why do not say less. Number 2, the question that we asked earlier. On one hand, Rashi says, do not say less, do not say more. But yet, a few verses earlier, he said, no, when you tell the men the laws of the Torah, tell them all the details, tell them all the punishments. Which means, I'm going to give you the general laws, but I want you to really hash it out. I want you to give every detail. Finally, a third question. It says over here, in verse number 7, Vayava Moshe, and after God tells him all these things, Vayikra leziknei ha'am, and now he calls to the elders of the people, the elders of Israel. Vayasem lefneim, and he placed before them Eis kol hadvarim eila asher tzava Hashem, all these words that God commanded. A moment ago, God tells Moshe, you shall tell the women b'lashon raka, in a soft way. You should tell the men in a very stern way. And all of a sudden, he tells it only to the elders of Israel. He doesn't speak to the women. He doesn't speak to the men. What happened? God just commanded him clearly. So shall you talk to the women. So shall you talk to the men. And all of a sudden, what does Moshe Rabbeinu do? He goes to the elders of Israel. How do we reconcile all these things? And the answer is as follows. There are 3 different things happening here. Not one. 3 separate things. Number 1, before God gives the Jewish people the 10 Commandments, the formal Torah, the formal teachings of the Torah, God tells Moshe Rabbeinu a few important rules. Number 1, you should know for all generations, as a teacher, you, Moses, being Moshe Rabbeinu, our first teacher. And the same is true for every teacher throughout Jewish history. And the same is true for every parent and every mentor. You should know, when you speak to the women, speak b'lashon raka, give them the general laws, and they on their own will be able to understand it. Number 1. Number 2, always speak to the women before the men. If you have the opportunity to talk to men or women, first talk to the women, then talk to the men. That's the rule number 1. This is true for the entire Torah. Number 2, when it comes to these 3 verses, when it comes to verse 4, 5, and 6, God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, even though I told you a moment ago how you should normally teach the men and women, when it comes to these 3 verses, you are to teach the men and the women equally. Do not add and do not diminish. Exactly the way I am giving these words to you, these are exactly how you are to give it over to the Jewish people. And that is, you saw the miracles that happened in Egypt. I carried you upon the wings of eagles. And if you will listen to my voice and you will protect my covenant, you will be for me a treasured people amongst all the nations of the world. And you shall be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words that you shall tell the Jewish people, these exact words. Do not explain it, do not elaborate on it, do not give details. Exactly the way I am telling you, that is the way you give it over. This is a unique law for these 3 verses. Number 3, Vayavi Moshe comes along and he tells the elders of Israel, give over these 3 verses to all the Jewish people. He gives them the opportunity, he gives them the zechut, the merit, and the honor that they should be the ones to go over and spread the law, spread the message that God is about to give them the Torah, and they are going to be a treasured people, a chosen people. Let the elders go around and give it over to all the Jewish people. 3 different concepts. Number 1, how to teach in general. Number 2, how to convey these 3 verses. Number 3, he now goes over to the elders to disseminate these 3 verses amongst all the people of Israel. Comes the question to mind, why is it that when it comes to the Jewish women, and the women in general, does the Torah say, this is the way you shall teach it to the daughters of Israel? There are many approaches to this. Let's take the following approach. When it comes to emunah, when it comes to faith, and when it comes to Yirat Hashem, which is the fear and awe of heaven, we find that the women have a greater quality and a greater quantity of this emunah, of this faith and fear of heaven. This already we see in the Torah when it came to the story of the bondage, when it came to the story of enslavement. The men did not want to have children. They said, why should we have children? And to raise them as slaves. We're not having any children. The women had emunah, they had faith. No, we have a mitzvah, we have a commandment to have children, to procreate, to continue our nation. And therefore we trust in God that He will spare us, He will take care of us. Your job is not to get analytical. Your job is not to decide the future of nature. God told us, Pru Revu, you have to have children, we have to have children. And they had this emunah, this unbridled faith in God. And this was their determination, and this was the reason and the schus of why the Jewish people were redeemed from the land of Egypt. So much was their emunah, so much was their faith, that when they left Egypt and they had witnessed the splitting of the Red Sea, it says the men danced and then the women danced with tambourines. Their dancing was greater. They had tambourines. Comes the question to mind, where did they get the tambourines? And the Medrash says they had tremendous faith that they're going to see miracles. And they prepared themselves with tambourines to be able to dance and to be able to thank God for these great miracles. Similarly, later on in history, when the spies came back after scouting out the land of Israel, and they gave a negative report, the men said, oh, forget it, we're not going to Israel, we're going back to Egypt. The women said, no, God promised us the land, He said it's a good land, we want to go into the land. What happened? God punished the men, that those men that were through the age of 20 to 60 perished over the next 40 years in the desert. But this decree did not fall upon the women of Israel. Why? Because they had emunas Hashem, they had a greater measure of faith in Almighty God. And this explains a very interesting thing, why we find that in Jewish law, who determines the nationality of the child, who determines if the child is a Yid, a Jew or not, that is the mother. The father could be the biggest, God forbid, Nazi in the world. May the names be erased. And the mother is a Yid, the child is a Jew. Because the mother determines the nationality of that child. Why is that so? Because they have the concept of faith. They have the concept of awe of God. This idea of emunah, of faith, is a klal, it's a general rule. It's a general foundation in Yiddishkeit. And therefore that determines, are you a Jew or not a Jew? Faith. And therefore we say, in truth, that every Jewish person is maminim, b'nei maminim, have faith, and they are children of faith. They have belief, and they are children of believers. So this faith was endowed through the mothers of Israel. And that determines their nationality. The details, if they're a Kohen, a Levi, or an Israel, the details, that we leave up to the men. If the father's a Kohen, he's a Kohen. If he's a Levi, he's a Levi. And that's why Rashi says, when it comes to the men, tell them the details, because that is appropriate for the men. Spiritually, this represents the two different lights of Soviv Kol Almin and Mamalik Kol Almin. The more pervading light, the limited light, are the details. The general rules of the Torah, this is the Soviv Kol Almin, the all-encompassing light. And in truth, husband and wife, as the Arizal tells us, are really two halves of a whole. And together they complement each other. Primarily, the woman is responsible for the general philosophy of the house, the general philosophy of the home, the general philosophy of our nationhood, and the men are responsible for the details. Klal uprat, the general and the detail. And when the husband does a specific mitzvah, like putting on tefillin, the wife gets credit for that, because they are half of a body. So the husband put on tefillin, the wife gets the mitzvah. When the wife goes to the mikveh, the husband gets the mitzvah. When the wife lights the Shabbos candles, the husband gets the mitzvah. When the husband learns Torah, the wife gets the mitzvah. Now, obviously, if there's no wife, the husband should light candles. But in general, the idea of how God created the Jewish home and how God created the world in general is that husband and wife work together to complement each other. And so the Arizal tells us that this is true for all generations. And as the Rebbe explains, not only after you marry, but even before you marry. Or let's say perhaps you never found your soulmate. Every person has a soulmate. So when the man is putting on tefillin somewhere in Jamaica, and the woman is lighting Shabbos candles at the age of 3 years old, somewhere in Jerusalem, each one is benefiting from the other person's mitzvah. So this is the concept of Koy Soymar the Beis Yaakov, so shall you tell the women of Israel, as my grandfather, blessed memory, Rabbi Jacob J. Hecht, used to say always, if you want the Torah to continue, then you have to make sure the women are going to accept it. Because if the women are going to accept the Torah, it's going to persevere. If the men, we don't know. But women, they are the foundation of the home. They are the akeres habayis. If they want it to happen, the entire house will be permeated with that aura of Torah and mitzvahs. So therefore, already at the giving of the Torah, God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, for all generations, first talk to the women, then talk to the men. And in general, we see that the Torah was given first in generalities and then in details. For example, God himself spoke the first two commandments. Anochi, I am God your Lord. I am God your Lord. And you shall not have any other gods. I am God, your Lord, says the Medrash, represents all of the positive commandments. You shall not have other gods represent all the negative commandments. And that's the way a teacher also teaches. First the general, then the detail. In conclusion, the Arizal tells us that the souls of this generation is a reincarnation of the souls that left Egypt. And just like it was in the merit of women that we left Egypt the first time, so too it's going to be in the merit of women that we're going to leave this galus, this exile, with the coming of Mashiach. And therefore that is the emunah tohira, this pure faith and this awe of God that they naturally possess. And by inspiring their spouses, by inspiring the children, by inspiring the family, and by inspiring the entire community, this is the way we will prepare ourselves to lead the entire family and to lead the entire nation. L'kavod Pnei Mashiach Tzidkeinu. I want to conclude with one short story. The Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch, not only did he teach the men the deepest secrets of Chassidus, but he also taught his daughter Freda, who was a brilliant woman. He used to have a separate time when he used to give her over a Maimer Chassidus, a Chassidic discourse. And nobody was allowed to come into the room. It was just him and her. She had a brother by the name of Berel, who became the Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe. And he was very jealous that the Alter Rebbe was teaching his older sister the secrets of Chassidus. So he went to his sister Freda and said, Freda, would you mind if I perhaps came into the room when Daddy is teaching you? I'll hide under the bed, he won't see me, and I'll listen to the Maimer. Freda, being a good-hearted girl, said, not a problem. So the Mittler Rebbe hides under the bed. The Alter Rebbe comes in and begins to give over a Chassidic discourse. The Chassidic discourse was the 8 different garments that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wore. And Alter Rebbe explains each one according to Chassidus, what it means, the breastplate and the golden band on the head and the me'il, all these things. Alter Rebbe is about to finish and walk out, and all of a sudden Berel pulls his sister on the dress, on the bottom. He says, ask about the gaitel. Ask about the avnet, the gaitel, the sash, the belt. So Freda goes, yeah, and by the way, Daddy, what about the sash? That question is not coming from you. That question must be coming from Berel. From here we see that throughout history, and especially within the Chassidic world, the importance of educating and teaching the daughters Torah was primary. And that not only was it important, but when they studied Torah, it was them alone, and the men had no right to come in, because the Alter Rebbe felt that they deserved their right and their opportunity to participate in the study of Chassidus and in the continuity of our heritage. And this is all back to the verse in the Torah, Koi Soima Leves Yaakov, so shall you teach the daughters of Israel. So we hope and pray that in their merit we will see the end of Galus, and together we will go together L'kabel Pnei Mashiach Tzidkeinu.